We are here to announce a major lawsuit brought against brokers and landlords in New York City who purposefully and intentionally discriminate against low-income New Yorkers, people of color, and disabled New Yorkers. We're pleased to have with us today Congresswoman Velasquez, Senator Cavanaugh, the Legal Aid Society, Housing Rights Initiative, and Matthew Handley, who's one of the attorneys working with Legal Aid on this case, as well as Nancy Padilla, who is a client of the Legal Aid Society who has suffered discrimination. I want to start by introducing Congresswoman Velasquez, who we have worked with for years and is a huge champion for housing in general and a fighter against discrimination in housing as in other areas. And we're thrilled to have her here. So Congresswoman.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Judy. And I'm proud to stand with the Housing Rights Initiative and the Legal Aid Society this morning to discuss these disturbing allegations of landlord discrimination in our Section 8 program. The Section 8 program assists our nation's most economically vulnerable. Without it, many of the individuals and families assisted by the program will be at risk of homelessness. Here in New York, it is illegal for landlords and brokers to reject an applicant for using a Section 8 voucher. But as HRI's important investigation reveals, discrimination by landlords and brokers is still occurring. Discrimination of any kind, on any level, is wrong. We must all stand united against it. Housing is a human right, and rooting out discrimination in housing is especially important. Every person deserves a decent and affordable place to live. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated our city's and our nation's affordable housing crisis. 700,000 New Yorkers are estimated to have lost income since the start of the pandemic. And New York City apartment tenants were recently determined to be more than $1 billion in debt from missed rent payments. Alarmingly, our city's housing crisis is having a disproportionate impact on African American and Latino communities. Since March 2020, eviction notices are at least twice as high in African American and Latino neighborhoods compared to predominantly white neighborhoods here in New York City. The discrimination by landlords and brokers we are discussing here today is compounding our affordable housing challenge even further. And as a result, we are talking about thousands of vouchers holders here in New York City, in predominantly African Americans and Latinos, unable to leave overcrowded homeless shelters and substandard apartments, even though their Section 8 voucher gives them the financial stability and perhaps more importantly, the legal right to do so. Not only are landlord and broker policies and practices against renting to Section 8 voucher holders discriminatory and illegal, refusing to rent to a voucher holder makes the program less effective overall. It also compounds racial segregation and stereotypes. So this morning, I am proud to announce that I will be reintroducing the Landlord Accountability Act against this Congress. My legislation bans housing discrimination based on a tenant's use of a housing voucher at the federal level and provides Section 8 vouchers with all the same rights and remedies afforded to protected classes under the Fair Housing Act, including race, gender, and national origin. The evidence revealed by HRI's investigation demonstrate that discrimination by landlords and brokers is still happening despite efforts by some state and local governments like New York to prevent it. That is why a federal ban and the full protection of the federal government is needed. Passage of my bill will help revive the effectiveness of the Section 8 program. So I want to thank HRI for conducting this investigation and the Legal Aid Society for filing this important case. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I now want to introduce Senator Brian Cavanaugh. He is the Senate Chair of the Housing Committee, and he is a huge advocate for tenants and a fighter against this kind of discrimination. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so much, Judith. It really is great to be here with this really wonderful group. HRI and Legal Aid, thank you for your work to do this investigation and to bring the lawsuit, and Mr. Handley and Robert, and as well, and of course Nancy Padilla, who's I think going to speak in a moment, who's experienced what we're talking about here firsthand, and of course our Congresswoman who really fights every day to make sure that programs like this are adequately funded. We are at a moment where we are trying through federal and state action, through a new governance in Washington, and through really a new commitment in Albany to try to get to the point where everybody has access to an affordable, decent place to live throughout our state. But what the activities that we're talking about here really do undermine that. They undermine that by enforcing and fostering segregation, which we know has been the scourge of our housing markets for a century now. And they also do it by undermining these affordable housing programs. And this has been illegal in New York City for a number of years, and we outlawed it statewide in April of 2019. So there should be no doubt on the part of housing market professionals, real estate brokers, anybody who is dealing with tenants, that you cannot discriminate because somebody wants to pay their rent using a Section 8 voucher or using some other subsidy program. So I'm very proud to be here with this group, and I'm very thankful for the work, and I just wanted to lend my support.
Thank you, Senator. Now I want to turn it over to Aaron Carr, who is the Director of Housing Rights Initiative. HRI are the entity that put together this massive investigation, and I'm going to turn it over to Aaron now. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Congressmember Nydia Velazquez for your incredible support. Thank you to Senator Cavanaugh for joining us. I also wanted to say thank you to Handley, Farah, and Anderson, and the Legal Aid Society, our incredible counsel, and my entire team, Yvonne Collado, who's our Deputy Director, who played a very big role in this investigation, Kate Liggett, who's our Program Coordinator, Michael Sutherland, our incredible researcher, and last but not least, Sawana Wood-Davis, who was our lead investigator into the situation. So the big takeaway from our investigation, if it isn't obvious already, is that discrimination is alive and well in New York City and America. Earlier this morning, our watchdog group filed a federal lawsuit against 88 real estate companies for illegally discriminating against low-income tenants of color with housing vouchers. And this investigation didn't target any one real estate company. It targeted an entire real estate sector. And as the plaintiff in this lawsuit, our goal here is simple. It is to get real estate companies to abandon their discriminatory housing practices and to follow the damn law. Now, let me provide a little bit of context here. As was mentioned, in New York City and New York State, it is illegal for brokers and landlords to discriminate against Section 8 voucher holders. But nonetheless, our organization has received a litany of complaints over the years, alleging that real estate companies have been doing just that. So to combat this problem, our organization launched an undercover investigation to catch real estate companies engaging in mass civil rights violations. We trained, we equipped, and we deployed investigators who covertly recorded hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of phone calls posing as prospective tenants with Section 8 vouchers to see if brokers and landlords would accept those vouchers as they are required to do so by law. But in nearly half of all cases, real estate professionals refused to rent to our undercover investigators. And to make matters worse, housing discrimination was most prevalent in higher income white neighborhoods. The average median income of the neighborhoods in which we found discrimination was over $90,000 a year, and the average demographic makeup was over 50% white. For context, 82% of New Yorkers with housing choice vouchers are Black and Hispanic. So when you discriminate against tenants with rental assistance, you discriminate against tenants of color. Housing discrimination is exacerbating racial and economic segregation in one of the most racially and economically segregated cities in America. Now, a very important thing to keep in mind here is that the impact of housing discrimination is compounded by the fact that vouchers are not an entitlement. As a result of that, families only have a certain amount of time to find and lease an apartment before their voucher expires and it goes to someone else. So to put it another way, housing discrimination is prolonging housing searches and is resulting in the loss of rental assistance for families. And this is backed by the data. According to a study by HUD in 2001, just 70% of voucher holders nationally and over 57% in New York City had succeeded in renting apartments. So the social and economic costs of housing discrimination cannot be overstated. Families that are unable to use their vouchers have to spend the majority of their income on rent. And the more one spends on rent, the less one spends on food. And on average, families who are able to use their vouchers spend 40% more a month on food than families without vouchers. And this is a very important statistic because in 2020, nearly 1 in 4 households face food insecurity in America. So when real estate companies discriminate against families with vouchers, they aren't just screwing with their housing situation, they are screwing with their food situation. So now the children of those families have less to eat. And because they have less to eat, they go to school hungry. And because they go to school hungry, they can't concentrate. And because they can't concentrate, they can't graduate. And because they can't graduate, they can't earn a living wage. And because they can't earn a living wage, they struggle to feed their kids too, right? All because real estate didn't follow the law, and all because our government failed to enforce the law. This is the impact of housing discrimination, and this is the cycle of poverty. And it's a cycle that must be broken, and it starts with uprooting housing discrimination, and it ends with getting families into affordable homes. This investigation will go down as one of the most comprehensive investigations into real estate discrimination since the enactment of the Fair Housing Act, and we are only getting started. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I'd like to turn it over now to Robert Desir, who's the lead attorney for legal aid on this lawsuit.
Thank you, Judith. It's unfortunate that 50 years after passage of the Fair Housing Act and over a decade after New York City passed laws banning discrimination based on source of income, many in the real estate industry continue exclusionary practices that enforce patterns of segregation, stifle mobility, and concentrate poverty. It's unfortunate that people seeking something as basic as a roof over their heads are rejected without further thought, without any examination into who they are or what kind of tenant they would be once they mention they have a voucher. They are instead looked down upon and snubbed. They are outright told no. They are subject to standards that are not imposed on those without vouchers. They are told that advertised housing is unavailable when it is. Their inquiries go unanswered. They face superficial hurdles that categorically prevent them from accessing housing. This lawsuit lays bare the extent of this problem. The evidence demonstrates that in instance after instance, people with vouchers are told things like, this apartment won't work for you, or the owner will not accept programs, or this is not a Section 8 building, or this is not something that we usually deal with. This is all done in violation of local, state, and federal law. These practices violate the Fair Housing Act because of its illegal discriminatory effect and disparate impact on African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and individuals with disabilities. These practices also violate city and state source of income discrimination laws that clearly prohibit practices that deny or withhold apartments for rent because of source of income. And the effects are devastating. Even before the pandemic, New York City was in the midst of a homelessness crisis. Many families living in shelter have subsidies that would allow them to access safe, affordable housing in desirable areas. The scenario is the same for those who would like to escape substandard housing or simply access areas of opportunities just like anyone else. But they can't because their efforts are continuously thwarted by gatekeepers who refuse to follow the law. As a result, New Yorkers, whether single people, families, seniors, those with disabilities, or veterans, are forced to endure homelessness, indignity, instability, and limited choices. The team at the Legal Aid Society, which in addition to Judith and myself, includes Sam Frizzell and Lilia Tosin, we're honored to stand with apartment renters who persist in spite of these obstacles. We're honored to stand with the Housing Right Initiative who took decisive action to address this problem. We're honored to stand with our elected officials and our partners at Handley, Farah, and Anderson as we hold these bad actors accountable and increase access to the basic human right of housing for our most vulnerable New Yorkers.
Thank you, Robert. I now want to introduce Matthew Handley from the firm of Handley, Farah, and Anderson, who is our critical partner in this lawsuit. Matthew.
Thank you, and I can't say enough how pleased and honored I am to be here today alongside our co-counsel from the Legal Aid Society and our client Housing Rights Initiative to announce the filing of this litigation challenging the rampant discrimination encountered by HRI's investigators. And I'm particularly honored to also have Congresswoman Velasquez and Senator Cavanaugh and Ms. Padilla be here too to lend their support. As you've heard, in almost half of HRI's investigators' calls to brokers and landlords, the caller was led to believe that a voucher holder was unwelcome at that property. This is explicitly illegal under both New York State and New York City law and amounts to prohibited race and disability discrimination under the Federal Fair Housing Act. But it's clearly not sufficient for something to merely be unlawful for these practices to stop. We believe that robust enforcement of these laws is the only way to ensure that the real estate industry in the city is compliant with the law. That is what our lawsuit aims to do. Now, by way of comparison, for decades, the District of Columbia has had similar source of income protections as that which now exists under both New York State and New York City law. And in the past 10 years, there's been robust private enforcement of DC law by local fair housing groups, as well as public enforcement by the DC Attorney General. As a result, instances of voucher refusal in DC are a small fraction of those that were encountered by HRI through their investigation of New York City brokers and landlords. Indeed, a study by the Urban Institute in 2018 showed that only 15% of landlords in DC still tried to refuse voucher holders, compared to more than 67% to a 67% refusal rate in cities with either no source of income protection or lackluster enforcement of existing laws. This tells us that we can put a serious dent in this unlawful practice by enforcing the fair housing laws to prevent such discrimination, which is what we are prepared to do with this lawsuit. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I now want to introduce Nancy Padilla. Nancy was a client of the Legal Aid Society, and she has a sad story to tell, although I'm very happy that Nancy actually has been able to find housing now. So thank you so much, Nancy, for being here and telling your story. Nancy, you need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith.
Nancy, you can go ahead now.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Sorry. Good morning to all. I am Nancy Padilla. I am a current legal aid client and tenant. I am here today to speak on the topic of housing discrimination by landlords and brokers. The housing discrimination that I experienced did not just affect where I live. It also impacted every facet of my life. It kept me trapped in the shelter system for years, longer than I expected, even when I was eager and ready to get back on my feet and out of the shelter system and have a productive life again. I hold in my hands the files of all the years in the shelter system. Book 1, book 2. It's like an encyclopedia. okay? During my long history in the system because of all the discrimination I faced, I spent years trying to find an apartment via online apps, Nitro Portal, or directly with a landlord or broker. Every time a landlord or broker saw my voucher, be it City Steps or Section 8, their whole face expression changed. Immediately, and they turned me away, even though I was qualified and passed the background check and the credit check. And after paying so much apartment application fees, once they saw the voucher, it was a stop sign, no go further. I should also note that in some of the shelters I was in, I was on the board of directors to advocate for individuals who also needed guidance on the law and our rights as human beings. I knew my rights and I was a powerful advocate for myself as well as others. But unfortunately, not everyone has access to these resources. I proceeded to find an organization that can help me. I reached out to the legal aid, I reached out to the local senator's office, and I reached out to the Commission of Human Rights. I also noticed that landlords tend to raise the rent extremely high, that some of these vouchers are unable to pay the high rent. So it keeps you in the shelter system. This should not happen to anyone, It's unfair and it's illegal. Being continuously discriminated against over and over and being rejected puts a toll on a person who is trying. I believe landlords and brokers who discriminate against people who have vouchers need to be held accountable for their actions. And I hope this lawsuit can stop anyone else from having to experience what I experienced. No one should feel as if someone has you as a puppet and they're holding the string. Justice needs to be heard and seen. And I thank you for your time, Ms. Padilla. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Padilla. Really, your story is so important. You've been able to find housing now, though, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
That's great news. I know it was a struggle. So we're gonna now open up 2 questions and answers. So if people want to post, I know there are a few, if people want to post questions in the chat, in the Q&A, we can give those questions to the right folks. Well, let me start by, I think if you can, instead of raising your hand, if you can put your question in the question and answer, then we can make sure your questions get answered. The quick answer to the question on when the lawsuit is going to be filed, the lawsuit was already filed this morning. So a couple of questions for the elected officials on the call. There are 2 questions about strengthening. So a question about prohibiting discrimination in co-op and condos, and also a question about what should happen to strengthen discrimination laws to make this type of behavior less likely. So let me turn it over. I think Senator Cavanaugh wanted to say something, and then the Congress.
Yeah, I'm happy to defer to the Congressman if you want.
Or either.
Well, as I said before, discrimination on any level is wrong. And if there are similar allegations with co-ops, we will look into it. And if there is a federal hook, believe me, I'm going to be there. But the message is clear to brokers and landlords. We're going to go after you. You know that this is illegal, and we will use the power and every tool in our toolbox so that you get the message.
And yeah, just so these are important questions. Thank you for. It's odd to do press conference where we can't hear the questions directly, but thank you for asking them. The first is with respect to co-ops in particular. That has been a long-standing complaint. We actually have legislation that we've been pushing. When somebody applies, co-ops are an unusual situation where somebody who applies to live in a building and especially with sales, the owner of the unit may want to sell it to the person and a buyer may want to buy it, but there's this third party, the co-op board or the management company, that gets to choose whether to permit that person to live in that building. And that creates all kinds of fairness and a huge opportunity for discrimination. So we do have legislation that I've introduced that we've been working on that would, first of all, require co-op boards to answer promptly to basically establish that the application is complete, and it sets a time frame for them to say yes or no. In many cases, co-op boards that want to discriminate can just delay endlessly and not give an answer. It also requires that if they're going to reject a potential buyer, that they specify a reason for that. So that's legislation. Again, it's introduced in both houses of the legislature, and we are trying to get that done. With respect to renting in co-ops, the law is the same as, and I think the tools are very much the same as standard discrimination practices. Like for that purpose, the co-op and the owner of the unit are effectively a landlord renting to a tenant, and we can use similar tools there. With respect to strengthening our ability in general to enforce, again, the Senate did a year-long investigation in response to the fair housing allegations in Long Island. Those were in the home sale market, and put out a very lengthy report that articulates the problem, but also articulated a number of solutions. And we have now passed a package of bills in the Senate that we're hoping the Assembly will take up that is intended to ensure that everybody understands they have an obligation, all the governmental entities have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, but also that the resources are available to enforce and to do the kinds of investigation that Aaron and his team did so effectively in this case. And we give those resources actually to the Attorney General's office because we think that's an appropriate place because they have expertise in these laws and how to do enforcement, with the idea that they will fund adequately these kinds of testing approaches throughout the state. We do need a lot more of that. Again, Newsday and now HRI have demonstrated the effectiveness of this. And so, again, we're hoping that is a package that would add many millions of dollars to the enforcement effort. And we're hoping that the Assembly will take that up and we'll get that enacted this year.
The next question is for Ms. Padilla. How long did it take you to find housing?
Wow, approximately over 15 years. I was in the system that long. I just recently, been a year and a half now in my apartment.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Aaron, wow. Aaron, the next question is for you. Can you remind us when the investigation originally began? What led you to begin the investigation? Was there a certain catalyst or event that caught your attention?
Muted. You're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Congresswoman. Our investigation began about 1 year ago in full force. And we aren't just looking into New York City. We are looking into many parts of the country. And what led us to investigate is just over time, there's been a lot of complaints filed with our organization claiming that from tenants claiming that real estate companies, are legally discriminating against them. And one thing to understand about housing discrimination is that it's not an isolated incident. It is part of an industry-wide problem, and industry-wide problems require industry-wide solutions. And that's why this investigation was not against 1, 2, or 3 real estate companies. It was against an entire real estate sector.
Thank you, Aaron. Congresswoman, one of them, Telemundo would like you to make a statement about what we're talking about in Spanish, if that's okay.
Ok, en el día de hoy estamos discutiendo un lawsuit, una acción legal que se ha tomado contra dueños de edificios que se supone se renten y de los brokers, la gente que trabaja en que son los que están representando esos edificios que se van a rentar. El hecho es que en el estado de Nueva York y en la ciudad de Nueva York, discriminación de vivienda en contra de personas por simplemente tener vouchers que son sección 8 es ilegal. Y tanto Legal Aid Society, la sociedad de ayuda legal, como también Housing Rights Initiative, los derechos de vivienda, la iniciativa de derechos en la vivienda. Son dos organizaciones sin fines de lucro que son responsables por proteger los derechos de los tenants, de personas que están buscando hogares. Y es claro que con esta investigación que se ha llevado, una investigación bastante comprensiva, tanto Legal Aid como Housing Rights Initiative han llevado acción legal en las Cortes Federales para reclamar justicia por todas las personas que tienen sección 8 y que no se deben discriminar. En el día de hoy yo también estoy anunciando legislación que va encaminada a incluir el rechazo o la discriminación contra personas que tienen sección 8 como una violación en la Housing Fair Laws. Que vamos a estarlos protegiendo y se le van a imponer sanciones a esos landlords, a esos dueños de casa, esos caseros por discriminar en contra de nuestra gente. Thank you. Finish.
Thank you, Congresswoman. There's a question for Aaron on, sorry for a second. What's in the pipeline in terms of increased enforcement? Maybe for others as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to need to push the city council to fully fund, and the mayor to fully fund the source of income discrimination department in the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I think right now they only have a few staffers that are looking into these issues. As this investigation proves, I mean, we just had a few investigators looking into this. One investigator made about 80% of these calls. So if we can do it, the government can do it way better, but they need the funding and the political motivation to get it done. So this is going to be the big push from a policy perspective. We need to fully fund our fair housing agencies, and they need to systematically and proactively enforce our fair housing laws. There's no way around that.
Thank you, Aaron. There was another question about where someone can find a list of all of the real estate brokers who were sued. That is in the complaint. We can share the complaint. It's a very long list, 88, I believe. Right, Aaron?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And among these are some of the biggest real estate brokers in the city. I'm just checking to see what other questions there are. There is a question about the allegation of discrimination against people with disabilities. Robert, do you want to take that question?
Sure. While the investigation focused most directly on people with vouchers, it does have a discriminatory effect on people with disabilities when we consider that the population of people with vouchers that have disabilities is greater than the population at large. So it has an effect of discriminating on people with disabilities, although in the first instance, we are talking about the vouchers. So the investigation did not focus on disability directly, to answer the question.
I think that we've answered the questions that were posed in the Q&A. So I want to thank our distinguished panel here. Thank you especially to Congresswoman Velasquez and Senator Cavanaugh for joining us today. Oh, I'm sorry, there's another, I think that Telemundo has another question. But let's see if I can unmute. You are unmuted, Ray. I think you have to unmute yourself as well. I unmuted you, I believe.
Hi, this is David Rodriguez from Telemundo 47. Let me see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, let me try to get on the camera. If not, well, my question, because we're working a story about this today, I know that the tenant was making an explanation about how she had been waiting for 15 years for an apartment in New York City. I am pretty sure that she speaks Spanish. So if you can explain to us in Spanish, we see your frustration after the experience that you have here in New York City.
Ms. Padilla?
Oh,
Can you hear me? Yeah,
yes,
can you
I
hear
can
me?
hear you. I can hear you.
Yeah, in Spanish, can
Ms.
you?
Padilla, can you, sorry, go ahead.
No, can you explain in Spanish just a few words? You know, because we are doing a story today with this, and in Spanish, can you explain to us how do you feel? You know, after the 15 years waiting for apartment.
Ok, yo soy Nancy Padilla y sí hablo español. No perfecto, pero lo hablo. Lo que yo pasé en la sistema es injusta. Nadie debe pasar eso en la sistema. Esperando 15 años, 20 años para un apartamento. Mira los años que yo estaba en la sistema. Y todo por un voucher. Cada vez que yo iba con mi sesión 8 o mi city steps, me cogía mi dinero para el application fee, para el credit check, para el background check. El minuto que me ven el voucher, el apartamento no era para mí. Y eso se frustró una persona. Tú quieres salir del sistema, tú quieres seguir con tu vida. Eso es injusto para tratar gente así. Eso te pone triste, eso te pone a sentir como tú no vales nada. Y no es justo que esta gente tienen el derecho a hacer esto. Entonces, suban la gente porque saben que el voucher es un límite. Y también saben que tú tienes 3 meses. Si no es sección 8, te va a quitar tu sección 8 si tú no buscas un apartamento. So, tú sigues pagando para apartment fee, tú sigues pagando para el credit y paso todo con flying colors. Y me niegan. Entonces yo le dije, ¿por qué tú me niegas? Dame un razón. Nadie decía nada. No podía más. Ahí fue que yo fui para el local senator's office, fui para el legal aid, y entonces también fui para el Commission of Human Rights. Mucha gente no sabe su derecho. Y eso lo que yo estamos aquí para señalar y decirle a la gente que tú tienes derecho a humano. Porque tú tienes un voucher, no te deben dar discriminación. Eso está mal, eso es legal. Y si tú puedes guardar y grabar, no grabar, pero escribir cada sitio tú fuiste, cada persona tú hablaste. Porque al final es injusto a negar un apartamento por un voucher. Y
Thank you.
gente a propósito. Gracias.
Thank you. Gracias, Padilla, y gracias, congresista Velázquez, por la explicación en español.
Pues gracias a ti, mijo.
Gracias.
Un placer.
Gracias.
Thank you, everyone, and especially
you.
thank you, Ms. Padilla, for telling your important story.
Thank you.
I think we're now done. I know that in the chat, in the Q&A, people were asking for the actual complaint, and we will circulate the complaint after this. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone.